I am Alexander III of Macedon, but history would refer to me as Alexander the Great. This is my story. I was born in the year 356 BC in the ancient city of Pella, the heart of Macedonia. My mother, Queen Olympias, was a woman of fierce spirit and ambition, while my father, King Philip II, was a man of extraordinary vision and military prowess. The world that I entered was one of constant tension, power struggles, and shifting allegiances. The fate of kingdoms was decided on battlefields, and my birth was no different. It is said that on the very night I was born, the temple of Artemis at Ephesus was struck by lightning and burned to the ground, a sign that my life would be nothing short of legendary. I can still recall the early years of my life with vivid clarity. My mother's love was intense and protective, while my father's attention was often absorbed by his military campaigns and the growth of his empire. But even at a young age, I knew that I was destined for greatness. The stories of my lineage, of my grandfather Amyntas and the warriors who had come before me, filled me with an unshakable sense of pride and purpose. I was heir to a throne that would one day rule the world. From the time I was a child, I was no stranger to learning. My mother saw to it that I was well educated, often telling me that a king should not only be a warrior, but also a philosopher, a statesman, and a strategist. It was during my early years that I first encountered Aristotle, the great philosopher who became my tutor at the age of 13. Under his guidance, I learned about the natural world, ethics, politics, and the writings of the great thinkers. But more than knowledge, Aristotle instilled in me a sense of curiosity, a desire to understand the world around me. He taught me that the world was vast, filled with opportunities to explore, conquer, and understand. Despite the hours I spent immersed in learning, I never lost sight of my military training. My father was a brilliant general, and from him I learned the art of warfare. As a young boy, I accompanied him on campaigns, observing the strategies that led to victory. My father's tactics, his ability to inspire men and crush enemies, shaped my own approach to leadership. From him, I learned that success on the battlefield was not just about strength, but about cunning, foresight, and the ability to adapt to ever-changing circumstances. At the age of 16, I was entrusted with more than just the duties of a prince. My father left Macedonia to fight a campaign in Thrace, and I was given command of the army in his absence. I was still young, too young, some said, but I had already proven myself capable. During this time, I crushed a rebellion in the city of Byzantium and founded the city of Alexandropolis, named in my honor. My name, I believed, would one day echo through the ages, and this was just the beginning. This campaign solidified my confidence in my abilities and set the stage for the larger campaigns that lay ahead. However, it was not only the military aspect of my youth that shaped me. My relationship with my parents was complex. My father, King Philip, was a larger-than-life figure whose ambition knew no bounds. He had unified Macedonia and brought stability to a fractured kingdom. He had visions of expanding the borders of our empire, of making Macedonia the dominant force in the ancient world. But there were those who saw him as a tyrant, a man too obsessed with power. My mother, on the other hand, was fiercely protective of me and often spoke of my greatness in ways that both humbled and emboldened me. She would often tell me that I was destined to be a conqueror, the one who would bring about a new era in history. But with every step I took, I could feel the weight of expectation bearing down on me. My birth was a sign of something extraordinary, and I would not fail. As I matured, I began to see the complexities of leadership. I knew that my reign would not be without its challenges, that the path to power would be fraught with obstacles, both internal and external. But even in my youth, I was determined to meet those challenges head-on. I remember the day my father returned from his campaign. I had just turned 16, and I had successfully defended the kingdom in his absence. There was a sense of pride that filled me, not only in the victory, but in the fact that I had proven myself capable of leading in his stead. Yet, as I looked upon my father's face, I saw a man both weary and burdened by the weight of his empire. He had accomplished so much, but I could sense that there was more he wanted to achieve. His ambition, much like mine, was insatiable. But even as I looked upon my father with admiration, I knew that my path would be different. I would not simply follow in his footsteps. I would go further. The world, I believed, was vast and waiting to be conquered, and I was ready to lead my people to new heights. In the years that followed, I continued to prepare myself for the journey ahead. I learned not only from my father and Aristotle, but from the world itself. The empire my father had built was only the beginning. I was destined to extend its reach, to bring together the peoples of East and West under one banner. The training, the victories, and the lessons learned in those formative years would serve me well in the years to come. I had no doubt in my mind that the future of the world would bear my name. But for now, I was content to learn, to grow, and to prepare for the battles that lay ahead. My early years were marked by ambition, by the promise of something greater. I was not merely the son of a king. I was a king in the making. And one day, the world would know the name of Alexander, not as the heir to a throne, but as the ruler of the world. The day my father died remains etched in my mind, though I would rather forget it. It was in 336 BC when my life, no, the very course of history, took an irrevocable turn. The news reached me quickly. My father, King Philip II, was assassinated by one of his own bodyguards during the wedding celebrations of his daughter, Cleopatra. The world that had been shaping around me, the world I had dreamed of inheriting, was suddenly thrust upon me in an instant. I, Alexander, at the age of 20, was now the king of Macedonia. The weight of the crown was not something I was prepared for, but it was something I had been trained for, whether I knew it or not. My father's death left an empire that was both vast and fragile. I knew well enough the stories of how he had brought together the fractious Greek city-states, and how his military genius had transformed Macedonia into a powerhouse. The empire he built was strong, but it was also fragile, held together by his charisma, his vision, and his iron will. The moment I stepped into his shoes, I was keenly aware of the fact that it wasn't just about ruling. It was about maintaining the delicate balance he had created. The generals, the nobles, the soldiers, they all looked to me to see how I would carry forward what he had started. I had no time for hesitation. I wasted no time solidifying my position, for I knew that any show of weakness would be fatal. Some of my father's old allies were skeptical of my youth. They wondered if I was fit to take his place. They had seen my battle skills as a child, but now they would need to see my leadership, my decisiveness. The first challenge came from the Thracians, who rebelled almost immediately after my father's death. They tested my resolve, thinking perhaps I was not yet ready to rule. I would prove them wrong. I led my army into Thrace with a speed and ferocity that startled even those who had known me as a child. My men, although accustomed to my father's command, were soon to see that I was not a mere echo of him. I was my own man, with my own destiny. We crushed the rebellion, and I ensured that I left no room for further disobedience in the region. Not only did I quell the unrest, but I made a bold statement. This was my empire now. By the time I returned to Pella, I had shown that I would not be cowed by the challenges ahead. In those early days of my reign, I surrounded myself with advisors and generals who were loyal, but more importantly, capable. These were the men who would accompany me on the path to greatness, and we would forge an empire that no one could deny. At the same time, my grip on the Greek city-states was being tested. Athens, Thebes, and others who had been brought to heel under my father's rule were now questioning my authority. Some cities began to stir with ideas of rebellion, thinking that my ascension might be an opportunity to break free. I had no intention of letting that happen. In the spring of 335 BC, Thebes, that proud city, was the first to make a move. They gathered forces, believing that without my father, Macedonia would be weak. They were mistaken. I marched swiftly toward Thebes, my army ready for war. There, in the valley outside the city, we faced them. It was a battle that would prove the might of my rule. Thebes fell quickly, and as we stormed through the city gates, I made sure to leave no room for mercy. The city was destroyed, its people scattered, its walls torn down. I spared only the temples, a symbol of respect for the gods. But the lesson was clear. Rebellion against me would not be tolerated. The fall of Thebes sent a message not only to Greece, but to every kingdom that looked upon me with doubt. I was not the boy who had studied under Aristotle or watched from the sidelines as my father waged wars. I was a king in my own right, ready to carry the mantle of empire with the force it demanded. I was no mere inheritor of a throne. I was its rightful ruler. Yet even as I enacted these early triumphs, I knew that the weight of leadership would soon demand more than just military victories. I had to secure the support of my people, of my soldiers, and of the Greek city-states that were still uncertain of my resolve. I took the time to make gestures that would win their loyalty. I spared the leaders of Athens after they submitted to me, offering them terms of peace instead of the destruction they feared. I sent envoys to other city-states, reminding them that under my rule, Macedonia would offer stability and prosperity. But it was not just military might that I needed to consolidate. It was the political alliances that would hold the empire together. I sought to foster a sense of unity among the Greek states, and with that unity, I began to form a plan for the next chapter of my reign, one that would stretch far beyond Greece and Macedonia to the lands of Asia where the mighty Persian Empire awaited. To accomplish that, I had to create a foundation that would last. The first step was the establishment of my hegemony over Greece. With the support of the powerful city-states, I declared myself the leader of the Corinthian League, a loose confederation of Greek states that would support my campaigns against Persia. This alliance, though built on my military victories, would prove essential for the campaign I was planning. As I stood at the helm of my empire, I realized that my role was far greater than simply being a king of Macedonia. I had inherited an empire built by my father's hands, but it was up to me to shape its future. Every decision, every move, would be scrutinized by those who followed me and those who wished to see me fail. But there was no turning back. The crown was mine now, and the future of the known world would be shaped by my actions. There was no room for hesitation or doubt. As I gazed upon the lands of Macedonia from my palace, I knew one thing for certain. I was not just the king of a small kingdom in northern Greece. I was a man with a vision that stretched from the mountains of Macedonia to the deserts of Persia and beyond. And I would make that vision a reality. The path would not be easy, but I was prepared. My father's empire was strong, but it was I who would expand it to its greatest potential. The world would know the name of Alexander, king, conqueror, and ruler of the known world. The winds of destiny had been whispering to me for years, ever since I was a child. I had listened to the stories of my ancestors, the great kings and warriors who had left their mark on history. My father, King Philip II, had laid the foundation, uniting Greece and preparing for the war that would ultimately bring down the Persian Empire. His ambitions were never small, and though he had fallen just short of his final objective, it was now my turn. The Persian Empire, immense, wealthy, and powerful, was the great challenge of our time, and it would fall beneath my feet. I had been planning this campaign long before my father's death. My tutors had spoken of Darius III, the king of Persia, a ruler whose empire stretched from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River. But I had no illusions about the size of this challenge. Persia was not just a kingdom. It was the greatest empire the world had ever seen. Yet it was also decadent, bloated with bureaucracy and weakness at the core. I had seen how my father's armies had been able to win battles against larger forces, and I knew that my army, though smaller, was more disciplined and more determined. In the spring of 334 BC, I led my army across the Hellespont into Asia Minor, a land that had once been a part of the Persian Empire, but was now ripe for conquest. My first victory came at the Battle of Granicus, just a few months after crossing into Asia. The Persian forces were camped by the river, and I knew that this battle would set the tone for everything that followed. As we charged across the river, the sound of our soldiers' footsteps was like a drumbeat, heralding the end of an era. The Persian army, large though it was unprepared for the speed and ferocity of my cavalry. I led the charge personally, my horse, Bucephalus, galloping ahead of the others. The clash was brutal, but my forces shattered the Persian line. We killed many of their soldiers, and the Persian leaders were forced to flee. It was a victory that sent shockwaves across Asia Minor. The Persian Empire, which had long seemed invincible, was now on the defensive. But this was only the beginning. I had come for Darius himself, for the heart of the Persian Empire, and I would not stop until I had crushed it. After Granicus, we pressed on, capturing cities and towns along the way. We took Sardis, the ancient capital of Lydia, and soon after, we seized the city of Ephesus. Each victory brought me closer to my ultimate goal, but it also made me realize how much I still had to accomplish. The next great test came at the Battle of Issus in 333 BC. Darius had gathered a massive army, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, on the plains near the Syrian coast. It was said to be the largest army ever assembled in history. The Persian king, Darius III, had underestimated me, believing that I would hesitate before facing such an enormous force. But I saw this not as an obstacle, but as an opportunity. I would prove to Darius and the world that size was not the deciding factor in battle. Tactics and the will to fight were what mattered. The battle was fought in narrow terrain between the mountains and the sea, limiting the size of Darius's forces and giving me an advantage. My cavalry, as always, was the key to victory. We attacked with precision, hitting Darius's weakest points and forcing his army into disarray. The Persian king himself fled the battlefield, leaving his men to be slaughtered. It was another crushing victory, and it opened the gates to Syria and Egypt. I was unstoppable. The next obstacle on my path to total dominance was the Phoenician city of Tyre. Tyre was a powerful and wealthy city-state on the coast, and it controlled important trade routes in the Mediterranean. It was crucial to my plans to take Tyre before moving deeper into the heart of the Persian Empire. The city, however, was heavily fortified on an island just off the coast, a natural fortress that would seem impossible to breach. The Tyrians were proud, believing that no army could take their island, but I saw things differently. To underestimate me would be a grave mistake. I ordered my engineers and soldiers to begin constructing a causeway, a massive bridge that would span the distance between the mainland and the island. The task was monumental, but I was relentless. For 7 months, my men worked day and night, building and reinforcing the causeway under constant attack from the Tyrians. At times it seemed impossible, but my soldiers shared my conviction. We worked as one unit, driven by a shared dream of victory. When the causeway was completed, I launched an all-out assault on Tyre. The battle was grueling, but in the end, my forces prevailed. The city fell, and I gave the Tyrians a choice: surrender and live, or fight and die. The city was thoroughly looted, and many of its citizens were killed or sold into slavery. I made an example of Tyre. No one would dare defy me again. The entire Mediterranean world saw my power, and it was then that I realized how my name, spoken across the seas, carried the weight of something far greater than just the sum of my victories. Now, with Tyre and the eastern Mediterranean under my control, I set my sights on Egypt, a land both ancient and mystical. The Egyptians, weary of Persian rule, welcomed me as a liberator. They saw me not as a foreign conqueror, but as someone sent by the gods. When I arrived in Memphis, I was hailed as Pharaoh, and the priests of the land took me under their wing. They led me to the temple of Amun at Siwa, a sacred place where I sought the counsel of the god Amun. At Siwa, I learned of my divine parentage, confirmed by the oracle. The high priest declared me the son of Amun, and in that moment, my sense of destiny became even clearer. I was not just a mortal king, I was a demigod, destined to rule the known world. The words of my mother, Olympias, had been true. I was the son of Zeus, and now I had the endorsement of the gods themselves. This confirmation of my divine heritage emboldened me. I was no longer simply Alexander, son of Philip of Macedon. I was Alexander, son of Amun, the ruler of both Macedon and Egypt. The Egyptians recognized me as their ruler, and with their support, I founded the city of Alexandria, a new capital that would become the jewel of the Mediterranean world. Alexandria, with its grand library and lighthouse, would shine as a beacon of knowledge, art, and power for centuries to come. But my eyes were not on Egypt alone. The true prize, the heart of the Persian Empire, lay to the east, in the ancient city of Persepolis. It was there that Darius had his royal palace, and it was there that I would strike the final blow. In 331 BC, I marched toward Persepolis, taking with me an army that had grown stronger with each victory. The road was difficult, but we were driven by a singular purpose: to end the Persian Empire once and for all. The Battle of Gaugamela, fought in October 331 BC, would be the decisive confrontation of the entire campaign. Darius had gathered another massive army, larger than anything we had seen before, perhaps the largest the world had ever known. His forces were positioned on an open plain, and they outnumbered mine by at least 2 to 1. But I was not intimidated. This was a battle I had prepared for, a battle I had studied and planned for. My army was disciplined, my cavalry faster and more maneuverable, and my strategy was sound. As the battle raged on, I positioned my forces in a way that allowed us to use our speed and flexibility to our advantage. My cavalry struck the Persian flanks, while my infantry held the line. Darius attempted to break through, but his forces were fragmented, and his cavalry could not match the speed of mine. In the end, the Persian army was routed, and Darius fled once more, leaving his empire in disarray. I marched into Persepolis, the jewel of Persia, and in a symbolic act of victory, I ordered the city to be burned. The Persian Empire, which had once seemed invincible, had fallen. The conquest was complete, and I stood in the heart of the Persian Empire as its new ruler. But I did not stop there. I knew that conquering was not enough. I needed to unite the people I had conquered. The Persian Empire had been a patchwork of cultures and peoples, and if my reign was to last, I had to bring them together. I adopted some of their customs, dressed in Persian clothes, and even married a Persian princess, Roxana, as a symbol of unity. I aimed to blend the best of Greek and Persian cultures into one great empire, one where East and West could coexist. As I stood on the ruins of Persepolis, looking over the land I had conquered, I felt both a sense of triumph and a sense of responsibility. The world had changed. I had changed it. And though the Persian Empire was no more, the task ahead was clear: to build an empire that would endure for centuries to come. I had begun with a dream of conquest, but I realized that this was only the beginning of something much greater. I had not just defeated an empire. I had created a new world. The winds carried us further east, across the vast and uncharted lands that stretched beyond Persia. The Persian Empire had crumbled beneath our feet, but I knew that my journey was far from over. I had heard of the lands beyond Persia, of the fabled kingdom of India, where the riches of the world awaited. The tales told of powerful kings and armies that had never been defeated, and of elephants that could charge through battle lines with the fury of gods. For me, the conquest of the Persian Empire was only the beginning. The greatest challenge, the one that would define my legacy, lay ahead. In 326 BC, I crossed the Indus River into the lands of India, and I knew that nothing would be the same. The lands were wild and untamed, the heat oppressive, and the terrain unforgiving. Yet the promise of glory was enough to spur us on. We had already crossed mountains, deserts, and rivers. What were a few more challenges compared to the world I was determined to conquer? We marched south toward the kingdom of Porus, a powerful ruler who controlled the lands on the other side of the river. The Battle of the Hydaspes, which would unfold on the banks of that river, would prove to be one of the most difficult battles of my career, and one of the most defining. Porus had assembled a formidable army, one that included war elephants, a weapon I had never faced before. The sight of those massive creatures, towering above the battlefield, made even the most seasoned soldiers pause. But for me, the sight was not one of fear, but of opportunity. If I could defeat these mighty beasts, then nothing would stand in my way. We camped near the river for several days, watching Porus's army from a distance. The river itself was a challenge, swift and dangerous, its currents strong enough to swallow a man whole. Yet I saw this as an advantage. I would cross the river at night, under the cover of darkness, and attack when Porus least expected it. The night of the crossing was one of the most daring and dangerous moves I had ever made. With my army in tow, we waded into the river under the cover of darkness, the cold water biting at our legs as we crossed toward the far bank. The men were silent, their focus intense. We knew that this would be a test of everything we had learned in battle. We had fought in mountains and deserts, but crossing a river and attacking an army from behind was a gamble, one that could either win us the battle or doom us. We made it across, and as the sun rose, we found ourselves positioned on the opposite side of the Hydaspes River, with Porus's army unaware of our movement. The moment of surprise was ours, and I seized it with the precision of a surgeon. I ordered my forces to attack in waves, using our cavalry to strike the flanks, while my infantry engaged the enemy head-on. The battle was brutal, and the war elephants proved a formidable challenge. But we had our own advantages, our speed, our discipline, and our ability to adapt. As the battle raged on, I led my cavalry into the heart of Porus's army, breaking their lines and cutting through their ranks. The elephants charged at us, but we had prepared for this. My men were quick, and we struck at the vulnerable spots, killing the beasts one by one. The sight of those massive creatures falling sent shockwaves through the enemy ranks. Porus's men began to break, their courage faltering as their mighty elephants were slain before their eyes. The battle ended in a decisive victory for us, but it was not a victory without cost. We had lost many good men, and the toll on our soldiers was heavy. The men were exhausted, but they were also triumphant. We had defeated an army that seemed invincible. The war elephants, which had been a symbol of power, had been brought to their knees. And I, Alexander, had proved once again that there was no army too great, no challenge too difficult for me to overcome. But the victory at Hydaspes was not just about defeating Porus's army, it was about something more. When I met Porus after the battle, I did not see a defeated foe, but a worthy adversary. In the heat of the battle, I had seen his courage, his leadership, and his strength. When I spoke with him, I offered him a chance to retain his kingdom and become an ally. I saw the potential for unity, for the blending of East and West. We were not enemies in that moment. We were two rulers who could benefit from one another's strength. Porus accepted my offer, and together we forged a bond that would last for a time. I gave him back his lands and his title, and in return, he pledged his loyalty to me. It was a rare moment of mercy and diplomacy, and it showed the depth of my understanding of what it meant to be a ruler. Conquest was not just about bloodshed. It was about leadership, unity, and the ability to see the bigger picture. I had come to India to conquer, but I would leave with something more. A new ally, a new understanding of the East, and a deeper connection between the cultures I had already brought together. After the Battle of the Hydaspes, I continued my campaign through India. But something within me began to change. The further we marched, the more distant I felt from the home I had left behind. My soldiers, too, were weary. We had marched for years, crossing lands, defeating enemies, and building an empire that stretched across continents. Many of them longed to return to the familiar lands of Greece and Macedonia. Even I, at times, found myself questioning how much further we could push. The challenges of the Indian campaign had drained us, and yet I knew that my destiny was not one to be taken lightly. At the banks of the Bays River, my men refused to march further. They had had enough. They were exhausted, their spirits broken by the long years of war and the seemingly endless distances we had traveled. Some of them wept, some protested, but their resolve was clear. The journey east would have to end here. I stood before my men, the weight of their disappointment pressing on me. I had always been a leader who inspired loyalty, who led by example, and who led from the front. But now, I had to make the most difficult decision of my life. I had to accept that my campaign into India would come to an end. There would be no crossing of the Bays River, no conquest of the lands beyond. The decision to turn back was not an easy one, but it was one I had to make. We would march back to Babylon, to the heart of the empire we had built, and there I would turn my attention to what came next. But the dream of India, of conquering the eastern lands, would remain in my heart as a memory of what could have been. As we began our march back west, I knew that this was not the end of my journey. The world was still wide, and there were still battles to be fought, kingdoms to be built, and cultures to unite. But the lands of India and the Battle of the Hydaspes would remain one of the greatest achievements of my life. The march back from India was long and difficult, and though we had conquered the world as we knew it, I could not escape the nagging feeling that my greatest victories had already passed. My soldiers, tired and worn from years of relentless campaigning, began to show signs of their exhaustion. They had given me their strength, their loyalty, and their lives. But now, as we crossed the deserts of Persia on our way to Babylon, their resolve was slipping. They no longer saw the endless conquests and battles as the great adventure they once had. It was no longer about glory and fame. It had become a fight for survival. And I, too, began to feel the weight of the years. I had led my army from Macedonia to Egypt, across Asia Minor, Persia, and into the heart of India. I had crushed empires and defeated kings, but now, with the world at my feet, I found myself in a strange place. The thrill of conquest had given way to something more somber, something that was less about the future and more about the toll of what had been. The visions that had driven me, of becoming the greatest king in history, of uniting East and West under one rule, were being replaced by the reality of what such ambition demanded. My body was worn, and my mind, once clear and sharp, was clouded by doubts. The empire I had built was vast, but its future seemed uncertain. We finally arrived in Babylon in 324 BC, and I was determined to make the city a symbol of my reign. The Persian capital, which had once been the heart of Darius's empire, would now be the heart of mine. I had always dreamed of Babylon as a great center of culture and power, a place where East and West would unite. My vision was of a city that could rival Athens, a city where knowledge, art, and commerce flowed like the Euphrates itself. I began rebuilding the city, even going so far as to make it my capital, hoping it would serve as a testament to my achievements. Yet, in the back of my mind, I knew that even this grand city could not hold the empire together forever. During this time, I took the opportunity to marry several women, further cementing my alliances with the peoples I had conquered. I married Roxana, the daughter of a nobleman from Bactria, whom I had taken as my wife after the conquest of India. But I also married the daughters of Persian nobles and even some of the royal family. These marriages were not only about love or alliances, they were about ensuring the future of the empire, about binding together the cultures I had brought together. I wanted my empire to be one of unity, a world where Greek and Persian blood flowed side by side. It was my way of blending our worlds together. But as I sat in the grand palaces of Babylon, the city I had worked so hard to build, I began to feel the weight of my own ambition. The more I achieved, the more I began to wonder if I could ever truly be satisfied. The conquest of the known world had been enough to make me legendary, but it was also enough to make me restless. What more could I achieve? What was left for a king who had conquered everything in his path? And what would happen to my empire once I was gone? Perhaps that question was what led me to my next decision. The decision that would change the course of my life and the history of the empire I had created. I knew I had to make plans for the future of my empire, for it would not last if it were simply a kingdom of conquest. It had to be something more. I had to secure its future, and I had to ensure that my legacy would endure beyond my own life. In the months following our return to Babylon, I began assembling a new army. This one would not be for conquest. It would be an army of exploration, of discovery. I dreamed of pushing even further, into the Arabian Peninsula, into Africa, and even beyond. My ambition was still boundless, but now it was tempered by the realization that the greatest challenge was not the next battle, but how to preserve and expand the empire once it had reached its zenith. But those dreams would never come to fruition. Fate, as always, had its own plans. In the spring of 323 BC, as I was preparing for yet another campaign, I fell ill. The sickness struck quickly, almost without warning. My body, already ravaged by years of battle and the hardships of war, could no longer withstand the strain. It started as a fever, intense and unrelenting, and soon I found myself unable to move. My soldiers, my generals, those who had followed me through every campaign, watched helplessly as their king fell ill. The disease spread quickly, and soon I was unable to speak, unable to lift my hand to command my army. The once great conqueror, who had never been defeated in battle, was now a shadow of his former self. My strength, my will, all that had made me Alexander the Great, were fading away. And as I lay on my deathbed in Babylon, I realized that I had no clear successor. I had created an empire, but I had never planned for what would happen after my death. Who would take my place? Who would carry on the dream I had worked so hard to realize? In my final days, I was surrounded by my closest companions, those who had fought beside me in every battle, those who had been with me since the beginning. They came to me one by one, asking what should be done with my empire. They asked whom I would leave in charge. I could barely speak, but I managed to whisper a few words. To the strongest. Those words were meant to signify the chaos that would soon follow. I had created an empire that was without a clear line of succession. My generals, my closest friends, would soon fall into conflict, each one claiming a piece of the empire for themselves. The empire I had built so carefully and so ruthlessly would fragment. But that was the legacy I would leave behind, an empire of ambition, conquest, and greatness, but also one that could not endure without its creator. And then, on a hot summer day in 323 BC, I died. I could feel it, the end of everything I had fought for, slipping away like sand through my fingers. The fever had taken me, and the world that had once bent to my will now seemed to crumble around me. The army that I had led, the cities I had founded, the people I had united, all of it was now at a crossroads. And I, the man who had never known defeat, was powerless to steer its course. I had built the greatest empire the world had ever seen, but now that empire was on the brink of disintegration, and I was not there to control it. The days after my death were filled with confusion, fear, and turmoil. The generals and advisors who had followed me so faithfully, who had shared in every victory, were left in a state of uncertainty. They had no idea who would take my place. I had never chosen a successor, never named an heir to the empire. In truth, I had always assumed that the empire would remain united under my leadership, that I would never need to plan for a time when I was gone. I had been too consumed with the future of the world itself, with the next battle, the next conquest. I had failed to consider what would happen once I was no longer there to lead it. And so, my empire was torn apart almost immediately. The question of succession was a bitter one, and it didn't take long for my closest generals, men who had fought beside me in every campaign, to begin eyeing each other as rivals. The first of these was Perdiccas, one of my most trusted companions, who initially assumed command of the empire, acting as regent for my half-brother Aridaeus, who was mentally disabled, and my unborn son, Alexander IV, who was too young to rule. But power struggles soon emerged, and Perdiccas, though capable, had no real way of holding the empire together. What followed were years of conflict, betrayal, and bloodshed. The empire was divided between the very men who had helped me build it: Ptolemy, Seleucus, Antigonus, Lysimachus, and others. Each of them carved out a kingdom for themselves, claiming pieces of my once great empire as their own. Ptolemy took Egypt, where he would establish the Ptolemaic dynasty that would rule for centuries. Seleucus seized much of the eastern territories, including Babylon, while Antigonus claimed large swaths of Asia Minor and the heart of my empire. Lysimachus controlled Thrace, and the rest of my generals and family members fought for control over what remained. It was a brutal fragmentation of everything I had built. What had once been a single, united empire now became a patchwork of smaller kingdoms, each ruled by men who had once sworn loyalty to me. In many ways, my vision of a unified empire that blended East and West seemed doomed, scattered by the very ambition that had driven me. My generals, once so loyal, now sought their own fortunes, and they fought over the remnants of the empire like scavengers fighting over the bones of a great beast. But even as the empire split apart, I could not deny that the world I had created would leave its mark on history. The Greek influence I had spread throughout Persia, Egypt, and India would not easily disappear. The cities I had founded, Alexandria, for example, would become centers of learning, culture, and commerce that would endure long after my death. The Hellenistic era that I had begun would thrive, even in the absence of my leadership. My soldiers, many of whom had stayed behind to guard the cities I had founded, would continue to spread Greek culture throughout the known world. It was a legacy that would outlive the fragmentation of my empire. But, oh, how I wish I had done more to secure that legacy while I still had time. How I wish I had been able to choose a successor, someone who could hold the empire together after my death. If only I had not been so consumed with the future that I had ignored the importance of the present. I should have realized that, without a clear plan for succession, the empire I had worked so hard to build could never endure. I had been so certain that my strength, my brilliance, my ambition would carry me through. Yet in the end, I had failed to prepare for the one thing that every ruler must face: their own mortality. The divisions grew worse, and the infighting continued. Perdiccas, the man who had assumed the mantle of leadership, was assassinated by his own men in 321 BC. His death marked the beginning of the so-called Wars of the Diadochi, the wars fought by my former generals for control of the empire. I could never have imagined that my death would lead to such chaos. The very men I had trusted to carry on my vision were now locked in mortal combat, battling for pieces of the empire I had built with such ambition. But amidst all the fighting, I cannot help but feel a sense of pride. The fact that my empire, though divided, remained a force to be reckoned with is a testament to the power of the vision I had. My generals may have fought for control, but they all knew that they owed their power to me. My name would live on in their hearts and in the hearts of those who would follow them. My ambition, my dream of uniting East and West, would endure in the culture, the cities, and the ideals I had left behind. As I lie here in the afterlife, I can only watch as my empire fades, splintered into pieces by the very men I had trusted. But even in the fragmentation, I find a certain comfort. For while the empire may have been divided, the world I shaped would never be the same again. I had taken a world divided by kingdoms and cultures and created something greater, a world where East and West no longer stood apart, where the legacy of Alexander the Great would leave an indelible mark on history. My generals may fight, they may divide the lands I once held, but the ideas I instilled, the dream I pursued, and the empire I created will never disappear. The sun may set on my empire, but my legacy will shine as bright as the stars above. Though I am no longer alive, my name still echoes through the ages. In the years after my death, the empire I built split apart, and the wars between my generals, the Diadochi, destroyed much of what I had fought so hard to unify. Yet, in the midst of that chaos, a new world was born. A world that bore the marks of my ambitions, my victories, and the vision I had for the future. It was a world that would come to be known as the Hellenistic Age, and even though I was not there to witness it, I can feel it in my bones. A world shaped by the merging of East and West, where Greek culture spread and thrived in places I had never set foot. As the years passed, I came to understand something fundamental about my legacy. It was not simply the vast empire I had created that would be remembered, nor the battles I had won. It was the fusion of cultures, the blending of traditions, the mingling of peoples, that would define the true power of my vision. In the aftermath of my death, my generals fought bitterly over my empire, dividing the lands I had conquered among themselves. Ptolemy took Egypt, Seleucus claimed much of Persia and the eastern territories. Antigonus controlled Asia Minor and parts of Syria, and Lysimachus ruled over Thrace. They fought, as I had predicted, and the empire was never the same again. But what remained of my conquests, what persisted beyond the squabbles of men seeking power, was the foundation I had laid. My soldiers had carried Greek culture and ideas with them wherever they went, and it took root in foreign lands. The cities I founded, Alexandria in Egypt, for example, became centers of learning and culture. Alexandria would become one of the greatest cities in the ancient world, a beacon of intellectual achievement where scholars from all corners of the empire would gather to exchange ideas. The Great Library of Alexandria, a repository of knowledge from across the world, would stand as a symbol of the intellectual flourishing that my conquests had facilitated. The influence of Greek philosophy, art, and science spread far beyond the borders of Greece. The great thinkers, Aristotle, who had tutored me as a boy, had shaped much of my early worldview, and their ideas, too, were carried eastward. The blending of Greek and Persian ideas gave birth to new schools of thought, and the fusion of Eastern and Western art created styles that reflected both the grandeur of Persian palaces and the simplicity of Greek temples. But the true power of the Hellenistic world was in the blending of peoples. The cities I founded were not just Greek. They were multicultural, vibrant centers where Greeks, Persians, Egyptians, and Indians could live together and interact. I encouraged marriage between Greek and local women, as I had done myself with Roxana, and I believed that through these unions, the diverse peoples of my empire would become one. These intermarriages were not always popular with the Greeks, but they were a key part of my vision for a united world. In my eyes, the Greek world was not just about Greece itself. It was about spreading the ideals of Greek civilization to every corner of the world. The Persian Empire had been great in its own right, but it was the Greek spirit, the love of knowledge, of democracy, of philosophy, that I believed would truly bring the world together. I wanted to build a civilization that transcended borders, that fused the best of every culture, so that no one would be a stranger to the ideas of another. I also promoted the idea of shared culture in the cities I founded. Each city was a microcosm of Greek ideals, but also a place where local customs and traditions were respected and preserved. I envisioned these cities as places where knowledge and commerce would flow freely, where people of different backgrounds could meet, exchange ideas, and learn from one another. Though the empire itself did not last, those cities became enduring symbols of the Hellenistic world. Perhaps one of my greatest achievements was the spread of Greek language. The Greek tongue became the lingua franca of much of the ancient world, from Egypt to India, a unifying thread that connected people across vast distances. As I traveled from Greece to Egypt to Persia and beyond, I realized that language was one of the most powerful tools I had at my disposal. The spread of Greek allowed ideas to travel freely, unimpeded by the barriers of local dialects. It made trade, philosophy, and art accessible to more people than ever before. Despite the fragmentation of my empire, my influence on the world continued. The Hellenistic Age, as historians would come to call it, flourished in ways I could not have foreseen. The greatest minds of the era, Euclid, Archimedes, Ptolemy, would emerge from the world I had helped shape. The cities I had founded would become hubs of learning and scientific progress, and the Greek way of life would endure in these places for centuries. As I look back from the afterlife, I understand that my legacy is not just a legacy of war and conquest. It is a legacy of ideas, of cultures blending and enriching each other. It is the legacy of a world that no longer saw itself as separate nations, but as a greater whole, united by common ideals and a shared language. The Hellenistic world would eventually give way to the Roman Empire, which would further spread Greek culture across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. But the seeds of that empire were planted in the world I had created. Rome itself would adopt many aspects of Greek culture, from architecture to philosophy, and in many ways, the legacy of Alexander the Great would live on through the Romans. I often think about the men who fought for my empire, the soldiers who carried my banners into battle, and the philosophers who sought to make sense of the world I had created. What would they say now, knowing that the world I shaped would never be the same again? That my vision of a united world, one that blended the best of East and West, would live on even after my empire crumbled? I built an empire that, in the end, could not endure, but I built something else too. A legacy of culture, knowledge, and unity that outlasted the borders of any one kingdom. The world I dreamed of was not one of endless conquests. It was one where ideas could travel freely, where cultures could meet and enrich one another. In the end, I may not have created a lasting empire, but I had laid the foundations for a new world, one where the legacy of Alexander the Great would endure, not in the blood and soil of battlefields, but in the minds and hearts of those who came after me. I have lived 1,000 lives, and yet none of them are truly my own. I was a conqueror, a king, a dreamer. I saw the world as no one had seen it before, endless, full of promise and ripe for the taking. But as I lie here, separated from the world I once knew, I can only wonder how the men and women of my time, my soldiers, my companions, and even the distant people who lived in the lands I touched, remember me. Do they see me as a god, as I often wished to be? Or do they see me simply as a man, flawed, driven, and ultimately doomed by the same ambition that carried me to the farthest corners of the earth? I have crossed deserts, sailed across seas, and toppled empires. I have stood in the heart of great cities, breathing in the dust of history, and I have laid waste to those same cities in the name of my vision. I have been celebrated as a hero and reviled as a tyrant. But now, in the quiet afterlife, I see everything with a clarity that was often clouded in the heat of battle. I can no longer hear the cries of my soldiers or the thunder of hooves on the battlefield. I can only hear the whispers of my thoughts, and they ask me, was it all worth it? I have always been defined by my ambition. From the moment I picked up a sword, I was driven by the belief that I was destined for greatness. The gods themselves had chosen me. I was the son of Zeus, the heir to an ancient kingdom, and I would carve my name into the annals of history. But now, I see that the gods were not as interested in my greatness as I had once believed. They gave me the power to conquer, to dream, and to achieve. But they also gave me the same flaws that all men possess. And in those flaws, I lost what I had fought so hard to create. I had sought to unite the world. I had wanted to merge East and West, to bring together the disparate peoples of the earth under one banner. And in a way, I succeeded. Greek culture spread across the ancient world, from Egypt to India, and the cities I founded became lasting symbols of the fusion I had dreamed of. But my empire, though vast, was never truly united. It was built on blood, on the backs of my soldiers, and on the unyielding desire to be the greatest. But greatness, I have come to realize, is a fleeting thing. Even the most powerful empire will one day crumble, and even the mightiest kings must face their own mortality. What I failed to see, what I failed to understand in my pursuit of glory, was the fragility of the very empire I sought to create. I never thought about what would happen after me. I had no plan for the future, no vision beyond the conquest. My generals, those who had once been my closest companions, fought for power, and my empire fractured. The bloodshed and betrayal that followed my death were inevitable. I had been so consumed by my dream of a unified world that I had neglected the one thing that might have made it last: stability. And yet, despite all that I lost, I can still take pride in the legacy I left behind. The Greek influence on the world, the cities that became beacons of learning, and the blending of cultures that brought East and West closer than ever before. All of this is a part of me. It is not the empire that lasted, but the idea of a world united through knowledge, commerce, and shared ideals. I had hoped to create a legacy that would endure forever, and in that, I have succeeded. Not through the sword, but through the mind. In the silence of my afterlife, I find peace in the knowledge that my story was not just one of conquest and war. I see now that I was more than a warrior. I was a catalyst for change. My vision for a new world, a world where cultures could coexist and enrich one another, may have faltered in my lifetime, but it planted seeds that would grow long after my death. The Hellenistic world that emerged in the wake of my conquests, with its blending of Greek, Persian, Egyptian, and Indian ideas, would lay the foundations for the development of civilizations for centuries to come. The Romans, who would follow, would inherit much of what I had created, from the Greek language to the architectural styles and philosophical ideas that shaped their empire. The legacy of my conquests would live on through the Empire of Rome, which would stretch across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. And in the cities I founded, from Alexandria to Antioch, the exchange of knowledge and ideas would continue long after my death.